Los Angeles police were marshaled in a battle array to make war. That's how one of the papers described it. In September of 1927, Southern California was rocked by payroll heists, bandit queens, and even a fallen police chief gone bad. The headlines called it a war, and the City of Angels was its front line. Brazen bands of criminals committed series of crimes, and the papers ran stories about the $100,000 bandit, the holdup of a Standard Oil service station, a branch of the Citizens Trust and Savings Bank was hit, and two men posing as prospective tenants robbed a Mrs. Ann Collins, apartment house owner, of a $3,500 diamond ring, all on the same day. But grabbing the most headlines was what the police initially described as the perfect crime: the $73,000 payroll holdup in downtown Los Angeles of the Municipal Department of Water and Power. Chief of Police James Davis later blamed, quote, Eastern gangsters, end quote, and police were even considering a possible inside connection to aid them. Here's how it happened. Early in the day, one of the six-man crew kidnapped the, quote, one-armed payroll guard, Fred Kimple, as he made his way to work that morning. At some point, they told him, quote, they made bums of us out in Owens Valley. We're getting even now, end quote. Police believe that was actually a misdirection ploy to cast suspicion on opponents of some city aqueduct project. Inside the Water and Power office, two men slipped into disguise, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The two robbers who wore the eye shades also carried hidden rubber balls and school book straps that were later used to gag the three employees. When George Pasil, S.F. Arthur, and Glenn Brockway arrived to begin the payroll process, they noticed two men sitting behind a counter with eye shades on and assumed they were employees. When the safe was opened, one of the robbers said, quote, stick 'em up, end quote. Then one robber scooped up the money and the other bound the three employees. The victims were later found by Milton Fischel, who called the police. Meanwhile, two others waited outside in a getaway car, while two others were thought to be acting as lookouts. The getaway car headed east out of the city along with guard Fred Kimple, who was still cramped into the sedan. Then the guard was later released out in a suburb when he was, quote, thrown out at Alhambra 10 miles east, end quote. William Mulholland, veteran chief of the city's Bureau of Water and Power, declared, quote, it's a wonder we haven't been stuck up before with such a system of payoff as that. You can bet it was an inside job, end quote. The three employees later scoured the rogues gallery but failed to identify anyone in the photos, leading police to admitting, quote, little hope is held for the capture of the Water Power Bureau bandits, end quote. At some point, however, they noted a flaw that they thought could lead to the arrest of the six men they thought were believed involved in the heist. And sure enough, a few days later, two detectives left Los Angeles for Ventura to bring back one Joseph G. Samelin. He was, quote, principal in a wild chase down the East Coast Highway, end quote, as well as a suspect in the $73,000 Water Power payroll holdup. The chase involved speed cars and motorcycle men, and shots were fired at Samelin during the chase. Though Samelin was not hit, the chase actually culminated with Samelin overturning his car. Samelin was noted to have, quote, a scar across his nose, end quote. And it was noted that one of the bandits in the payroll job, quote, wore a piece of plaster across his nose, end quote, probably in an attempt to hide the scar. These are the types of rogues we follow on Decades of Gangsters, tracing their dastardly deeds from 1926 until 1941, when the U.S. enters World War II. But even as detectives chase leads in the payroll heist, other cases began to crack wide open. The arrest of one prolific burglar dubbed the $100,000 bandit gave police a much-needed win. Fred M. Purcell, indeed the $100,000 bandit, was arrested after a pawnbroker tipped them off. He led them to a garage in Glendale where Purcell had cached most of his loot. Authorities gathered up, quote, 2 automobile loads of radios, furs, jewels, guns, and a bric-a-brac, end quote, amounting to over $50,000 in loot. Meanwhile, the short-lived, ill-fated saga of former chief of police of Seal Beach, Thomas Randall, age 29, ended with his arrest. He was taken while in the yellow roadster that was used in the heist of the Pasadena Savings Bank, for which he was charged with holding up and robbing of $1,800 a mere 4 hours earlier. He obtained the money shortly before closing, quote, under threat of arms, end quote. He confessed and was identified by bank officers as the lone holdup man, and only $1 was not found, the balance of $17.99 found on his person when arrested. Randall had a wife and 3 children, but was out of work and said he needed the money. Claire R. Moore, alias Claire Williams, was a, quote, pretty 22-year-old blonde, end quote, who was taken into custody in Los Angeles and charged with robbing E. W. Taylor, a Chicago bondbroker, for $1,200. She committed the crime, quote, at the height of a party in a downtown hotel, but was arrested the next day with a Robert Moran, 26, in a Hollywood apartment. The girl, according to police, met the description of the, quote, Bandit Queen, end quote, who was sought in the area for several weeks and was confirmed when police said they found a large sum of money, quote, hidden under a mattress in the girl's apartment, end quote. While Los Angeles crime headlines began to cool, aside from the stubborn water and power mystery, the heat flared elsewhere. In Alabama, a routine taxpayer turned into a highway robbery and deadly shootout outside of a bank. Sheriff J. E. Keaton, Deputy H. F. Moore, and Chief of Police A. E. Hester were trailing men suspected of committing highway robbery. James Johnson, quote, Negro taxi driver of Florence, Alabama, end quote, had been hired by E.R. Smith and A.L. Frank in Florence to drive them to a meet to pick up a man named Clyde Trippett. But the trio of Smith, Frank, and Trippett later forced Johnson to drive them into a woods where he was tied to a tree and relieved of his money, a watch, and the car. However, Johnson escaped and notified the sheriff at Cherokee, Alabama. So it was unknown to the would-be bank robbers that the sheriff and his posse were tracking the highway robbers. That tracking led officers to find Johnson's car parked just outside the Tennessee Valley Bank in Cherokee, Alabama, with one of the trio sitting in it. So Deputy Moore covered the man sitting in the car while Keaton and Hester moved toward the bank. The pair of robbers turned just as they were entering the bank. Clyde Trippett, 30-year-old farmer from Barton, Alabama, drew his pistol and fired at Hester with the bullet lodging in Hester's thigh. However, Hester was able to return fire, dropping Trippett with one shot to the abdomen, from which he died a few hours later. The other man hit Keaton in the ribs with the butt of his pistol, but was prevented from firing as Hester then covered him. A.L. Frank, 28, of Montreal, Canada, and E.R. Smith, 22, of Memphis, Tennessee, were taken to jail, where it was learned that they had red pepper and turpentine on them, which officers claimed was used to, quote, throw bloodhounds off the track. In addition, 2 .45 caliber automatics and a .38 caliber pistol were on them, along with James Johnson's watch. From the Tennessee Valley Bank to Tennessee proper we go, where we learn that Paul Jones, quote, dapper young bandit, was clubbed into submission last night, end quote, while attempting to escape with $1,000 from the First National Bank. Jones had attempted to escape on foot after forcing the cashier to fill a money bag with bills and silver coinage. His escape was hindered, so the 23-year-old, quote, laid down a barrage when pursued by officers, end quote. But they forged ahead without injury. Jones, on the other hand, was struck in the head with a pistol wielded by Chief of Police Bob Saylor, though he wasn't seriously injured. Jones clearly recovered because 6 days later, they were in the courtroom where Paul Jones' attorney read a motion to quash an indictment charging Jones with bank robbery. Now, perhaps addled by the blow to his head, Jones made an unsuccessful attempt to escape the courtroom shortly after that trial had been called. He failed in his plan when a deputy sheriff grabbed the youth at the back of the room near an exit. Needless to say, the motion to quash the indictment was promptly overruled and jury selection began. Beggars can't be choosers when one is looking to arrest a bank robber but finds a wanted forger instead. That was the case with Clarence Cannon, who was indeed wanted for forgery. He was arrested on a Monday night at the home of Dewey Harmon. Deputies Lawrence and Edmonston were the arresting officers. They went to Harmon's home since Harmon was wanted in connection with the recent Valley Crucis bank robbery. They unexpectedly found Cannon there and brought the alleged forger in to Boone, North Carolina. A mere one column away on that same page of that same paper was a note about the arrest of a Troy Cannon. Troy had been arrested on Monday night at his father's home just across the state line in Tennessee. He'd been arrested in connection with the Valley Crucis bank robbery. He readily admitted to the crime, and he and his father voluntarily returned to Watauga County. So he was arrested on Monday night, he was tried on Wednesday, and had already been sentenced to 3 to 5 years in the state prison at Raleigh, North Carolina. Evidence suggested he was, quote, probably forced into the crime by Dewey Harmon, end quote, who'd yet to be arrested. At that stage, posses were searching an area called Beach Creek for Harmon. During the bank holdup, cashier Martin L. Herman was forced to hand over the small take, which turned out to be just under $200. Cashier Herman stated that 2 men, unknown to him, came to the bank under the guise of taking out a loan, but he refused that loan. They left the bank, but returned a short time later asking for a smaller loan, to which Herman once again replied they didn't qualify. At that point, Troy Cannon poked a gun through the cashier's window, covering Herman, while Dewey Harmon entered the vault and swept up all the cash he saw. As he left the vault, Troy allegedly gave Herman, quote, a terrific blow on the left temple, end quote, knocking him down. The robber duo was seen traveling in a Studebaker that headed along the Watauga River near the Dewey Harmon home, incidentally, which is where the car was found abandoned. The robbery was noted to be the first successful bank theft in the history of Watauga County. There were 2 previous unsuccessful attempts at that same bank. A few weeks later, Dewey Harmon surrendered to Sheriff Farthing as his nerve weakened, and apparently he told the sheriff, quote, he knew escape could be only of short duration, end quote. And if robberies weren't enough, September offered up a courtroom drama. Rebecca Bradley Rogers, the young female bank bandit we've covered numerous times, was back in the spotlight, this time facing charges of arson related to bank theft. Rebecca Bradley Rogers' arson trial, a precursor to her bank robbery trial, was set to begin in early September, and the defense was poised to be ready to fight the arson indictment of this former University of Texas student. She was also charged with robbing the Farmers National Bank in Buda, Texas, and was awaiting that trial in Williamson County in October of 1927. Ironically, the same bank in Buda was robbed in mid-September of 27, this time by a lone bandit noted to be a heavyset man who entered the bank, pulled out a gun, and shouted, quote, stick 'em up and be quick about it, end quote. Well, he ordered F.A. Jameson and assistant W.M. Woods into a back room. He scooped up about $1,100 in 5s, 10s, and $20 bills. Jameson and Woods waited in the back room after the robber left. They conferred, and decided it was then safe to be able to leave the room. But just as they were heading out, the robber outside the bank glared in through the window and ordered them to, quote, sit down and shut up, end quote. He then got into a small coupe in which a getaway driver awaited, and they drove off towards Austin, Texas. Reminiscent of Rebecca Bradley Rogers' heist about a year earlier. Well, indeed, a jury was selected for the arson case, and the state was ready to present its first witness. Meanwhile, Otis Rogers, her husband, had somehow become lead counsel for the defense. This was his first professional appearance in court since graduation from the University of Texas Law School, and was ironically taking place in the same courtroom where they had wed. The newlywed Rebecca seemed in a, quote, jovial mood, end quote, telling reporters she wasn't worried about the case, but was concerned about her husband's cigarette consumption. He'd recently been discharged from a sanitarium, recuperating from tuberculosis and, quote, from a physical collapse, end quote. Rebecca's seeming lack of concern worried her friends and had baffled authorities. During the jury selection and subsequent process, he did smoke continually. Meanwhile, she smiled cheerfully. Quote, it's just another case of grandosia, end quote, said Dr. Livingstone Anderson, the state health officer. Thankfully, he went on to explain that grandosia was, quote, an affliction from which thousands of intelligent young people are suffering. They are moved to do a thing and proceed to attempt it without thought of the responsibility, end quote. The arson charge stemmed from the idea that she set fire to a vacant house near a Round Rock, Texas bank in order to distract the employees so she could go in and rob the bank. However, the ruse failed, so she abandoned the heist. Preceding that fire in Round Rock, a girl matching her description had inquired inside the bank what the employees would do in the event of a nearby fire. G.R. Lundlius, an employee of that Round Rock bank, identified Rebecca Rogers as the woman who interviewed him on business conditions on 2 successive days before the fire. She was pretending to be Grace Lofton, a reporter from the Waco Times-Herald. I find it interesting that she chose her mother's first name as part of her alias. On the 3rd day, she entered the bank and said she'd seen smoke coming from the deserted house, and then asked what employees would do on that occasion. Lundlius stated that the alarm even rang out during their conversation, and that Rebecca remained in the bank until after the money had been locked away in the vault at the end of business. He added that she wore a, quote, lumberjack sweater, end quote, which will be pertinent in a second. That all took place on December 10th, 1926, just 1 day before the Buda, Texas bank heist. The state completed its case by calling 6 witnesses who identified Rebecca Rogers as the arsonist, and evidence was presented that Rebecca Rogers had purchased kerosene and matches in Austin shortly before the Round Rock fire, while a neighbor testified that she saw Rogers enter the building shortly before it erupted in flames. The defense summoned some of Rebecca's friends to help establish an alibi, and her husband, Otis Rogers, the defense counsel lead, even testified on the witness stand that he'd talked to his wife the day of the fire and believed her, quote, incapable of wrongdoing, end quote. To establish his client's background and character, Otis Rogers brought Dr. K.P. Barton, former pastor of the university's church, who noted Rebecca to have been a, quote, faithful member of his church, end quote. And he also brought Rebecca's mother, Mrs. Grace Bradley, to the stand. She testified that her daughter was in Austin, Texas on the day of the Round Rock fire, and said that her daughter wore a dark velvet blouse and a brown skirt on the day of the fire, which goes against the idea of the lumberjack sweater. Her mother added that she even appeared at the state land office building in Austin where the mother worked. The defense made the claim that, quote, a form of insanity made Mrs. Rogers incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong, end quote, when she allegedly set the house on fire. Quote, she simply isn't there, end quote. Dr. Max Handman, a professor and criminologist from the University of Texas, told the jury, adding that indeed she did exhibit, quote, delusions of grandeur, end quote. Campbell Beard, a university instructor, testified that Rogers was, quote, afflicted with enlarged egoism, end quote. And Rebecca's mother was called to show that hereditary influences contributed to her daughter's ailment. To support that argument, she described Rebecca's father as, quote, eccentric, end quote, noting that he spent his time on inventions which never materialized and that he abandoned them without cause. Later, the state called an additional expert witness, Dr. Joe S. Wooten of Austin. He was there to refute the defense's assertion that Rebecca Rogers was, quote, unbalanced, end quote, and suffering from, quote, dementia praecox, end quote. Dr. Wooten testified specifically that she did not suffer from it. The case was ready to go to the jury. The charge given the jury outlined the nature of an alibi, explained circumstantial evidence necessary for conviction, and said that insanity was a valid defense if the defendant was of unsound mind at the time of the crime. Otis Rogers began his closing argument with a description of his romance and marriage to her, while, quote, a curious throng crowded the small courtroom, end quote. For whatever reason, the jury failed to reach a verdict on Rogers' arson case, so it was discharged. And after the jury left, it was said to have been a 9-3 vote for acquittal. According to prosecutor Harry Nolan, quote, dementia praecox was described as a disease criminals get when they are caught, end quote. Though Nolan did congratulate Otis Rogers on his initial argument before a jury. When Otis Rogers told Nolan how Rebecca had nursed him back to health and he expressed confidence in her, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and then the Rogers left the courtroom smiling. September rolled on with arrests, shootouts, and that high-profile deadlocked jury. And it continues next Saturday as we focus on a robbery combine that terrorized Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and beyond.